G'day,
Hey,
everyone.
Lauren.
Hey, Steve. Hello, everyone. G'day. I'm Lauren Kress. I'm the business scientist, and I'm joined by Steve Grace today. Steve Grace from the Nudge Group to talk about
Hello, everyone.
brand positioning. Are you excited, Steve?
I'm always excited about these things. It's always a little weird when you can't see your audience, but let's just get into it and do it.
Yeah, good point. And guys, as we go along throughout this, I'm pretty sure we can see your questions as well. So if there's questions and stuff as we go, let's make this interactive. Send your questions through. But essentially, what we're talking about today, Steve, right, is like this sort of paradox with brand positioning and storytelling when it comes to hiring top talent. So one of the things that you and I both kind of agree on is that when it comes to brand positioning, a lot of people think they have to have this super polished front, like they have to put their best foot forward. But when it comes to the sort of challenges that entrepreneurs are facing when they're rapidly scaling, this isn't necessarily the case. So, can we start off by talking a little bit about that in relation to what you do? So, what are some of the challenges entrepreneurs are facing when it comes to rapidly scaling their business?
Absolutely. Look, yeah, and I think you're right. I think a lot of people have this image that everything needs to be very slick and beautiful, and and it really doesn't. And no one expects that of startups. And I think founders and even companies that are growing very quickly, they don't need to be producing the same sort of level that large corporates with huge budgets do. That's not what it's about. I think in answer to your question, the hardest thing most of these companies when they want to scale up is that there are way more jobs than there are people in a lot of the areas that they look. So we're talking about things like marketing and development and all those kinds of tech focused roles. That there are a lot more roles than candidates. Even during COVID times, there has continuously been a lot more roles than candidates. So there's people are fighting for the best people. And if no one knows who you are, and no one knows what you stand for, and no one knows what your business is, it's very hard to get them to come and work for you. And I think that's probably the number one problem. I mean, you can only imagine yourself, if you're looking or you have a recruiter call you, or if you have two or three adverts that you've seen and you've never heard of one, you've got no idea, and it's got a weird, quirky name, as they all tend to these days. And then you've got two companies that you've always wanted to work for, well, you can see how that's going to be problematic for them.
So let's talk a little bit about what entrepreneurs and innovators and people watching today need to be thinking about to compete. So, can we start by talking a little bit about the storytelling that these guys are doing and perhaps not doing when it comes to trying to attract top talent?
Yeah, and we've spoken about this before. And someone may have seen us speaking about this before, but I think the number one thing that people don't do is tell their story effectively, because they haven't taken the time themselves to actually work out what that story is. And we do a lot of that with founders when we start to work with them. It's like, if we're going to sell your business and we're going to go out to the market, and you're going to have to business when we bring these people to you, you have to be able to tell your story. I mean, there's a lot of talk about storytelling in all walks of life at the moment, and human beings were brought up on storytelling. It's the thing that we've always done since time began. And I think people build these businesses and it's go, 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 and things happen and they grow and they have success. And then when they really want to scale, they haven't actually sat down and thought, okay, I know what my story was the day I started, but I haven't really had time to think about it. So we get them to take a breath, and we get them to create their story in a written form, actually write it down so that they can understand it, because it's often changed from what it originally started out to be. And a story is just like an essay, and I'm sure everyone got taught at school. An essay has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and a story has to have very much the same thing. It has to have a past, a present, and a future, and you need to be able to identify these. And I think a lot of founders can tell you what the past was. No problem with that. They can tell you what that was, although they don't always necessarily include all the right information, and we can come back and talk about that in a minute. They need to know what the present is, and that's often the one that's most confusing to them. They often know what the future is as well. They kind of know where they came from, and they know where they want to be. They don't actually know where they're at right now, and that's probably the most important part if you're about to join a company. You need to know where they are right now. It's important to know the future, of course, and you also need to understand what mistakes they've made. So sitting down with a founder and getting them to really, I guess, take the time. And they don't always see the value in it. It's getting that sort of across to them. And hopefully this live stream, some of them will see this and they'll begin to understand that taking the time, whether they're using a recruiter or hiring themselves, to know where they came from, know where they are, and that's really the hardest one to do, and know where they're going, is going to pay huge dividends in their ability to attract not just people, but the right people, because you have to find candidates or staff or employees or whatever you want to sort of label them as, who align stories with you. Because if your stories don't align, they'll leave. And that's the last thing you need when you're growing quickly, is people leaving, because then you're kind of fighting to stay afloat as opposed to moving forwards.
Yeah, I think like from my perspective as someone who's looking more at like the external story that we're telling, so how do we attract customers and how do we bring customers into our journey? It's kind of the same thing as well, right? Because it's like, okay, if you're just talking about like this polished kind of front of like everything's perfect and everything's okay, then you're not necessarily really building communities. And I think that's where, you know, even though I'm focusing more on that side of things and you're focusing on talent acquisition, it's like it all kind of comes down to telling this story that actually people can relate to. So I want to ask you a little bit about, you know, digging into kind of telling that less polished story. But I guess, you know, sort of a next step, can you tell us a little bit more about, you know, from your perspective, when you're doing this, what are some of the things you're talking about with candidates that kind of can win them over or not win them over when it comes to becoming part of a business that's rapidly scaling?
Okay, so there's two questions there, I guess, or two topics. Let's touch on the not so rosy bit past, because I think I've got a really good example of that. And you're right. I think most people are very aligned to selling what's wonderful, and that's great. But it also creates a sense of distrust, because nothing's always wonderful, and there's always bad things, and there's always things that have gone wrong. And not a lot of companies think about that, or they don't want to think about that, and they certainly don't want to tell the world about that. What we've found with experience, particularly with unknown brands, as well as brands, and actually the case I'm thinking of is quite a well-known brand. It's got a very successful, you can't really call it a startup now because it's been valued at over $1 billion, but they went through such rapid growth in their early years that they had some horrific reviews on sites like Glassdoor. And they weren't good at all. And candidates look at these things now, right? So you can't afford to ignore them. And as much as everyone who goes on Glassdoor tends to talk about negative things rather than positive, you still need to address that. And what they did was, rather than trying to hide that or try and get their staff to put good reviews on, which is a really bad idea that lots of people try and do, it just doesn't work. It looks so false. They openly admitted that they did it wrong, and they talked to us about it, and they wanted us to bring it up early with candidates, and they actually ended up changing their interview process, which I thought was genius. And they put another stage of interviews in, a very short stage, right at the beginning, where anyone who was interested was allowed to have a conversation for 20 minutes or so with the head of talent, where the head of talent would run them through what they did wrong, why it went wrong, happy to admit it went wrong, and happy to say, look, at the end of the day, if you're going to grow that fast, you're going to make mistakes. They made mistakes. They understand they made mistakes. They saw the reviews, but what they did was they addressed those mistakes. They changed the teams, the leadership style. They changed whatever they need to change, and they can actively explain now where they're going and why they've changed that. And what I found, and not many companies have ever done this sort of as openly as they did, the response from people was mind-blowing. The amount of candidates that I spoke to who were maybe a little bit, what's the right word, cautious or suspicious or what about that. You tell them this story and you explain it to them, and a lot of them, their attitude changes completely. And they suddenly become like, well, if a company's willing to do that, and they really like the fact that they're willing to do that and explain it and take the time and all those things that they did, they're like, now we want to know more. I really want to know more about a company that's actually willing to do that, because most aren't. So that brings you back to what you were talking about earlier. You don't have to have the beautiful, polished, sort of outgoing image. You have to have a real image that people can connect to, just like the story. It's all part of the same thing. You're trying to find people who are going to connect with you, your brand, your business, where you have been, where you are, and where you're going. The good, the bad, and the ugly. And that has been a game changer in their recruitment. Where they were struggling to get traction, now they're getting even more traction. So, it's amazing when you sort of break these things down and look at how the human brain works. And I think most people don't think about what they'd like to hear. They think about what they think other people want to hear, which is actually the same thing. If that makes sense.
It does. It actually makes me think of like this quote that Brene Brown shared on like Inc. magazine like a while back, where she said, the first thing that we look for in others is like vulnerability and openness and that kind of willingness to share our flaws. But the last thing we want to share from ourselves is that same thing. Like, like it doesn't make
Well,
sense, right? Like it's incongruent.
yeah.
Like we're looking for that. We're seeking that out. So let's talk a little bit more about, how you work with brands to kind of figure out how to tell that story to a candidate, a little bit more about the process, a little bit more about the how. So you said the present story is the hardest one for startups, for entrepreneurs, for founders to be able to tell. Why is that so challenging?
Because they're running. They're running like crazy, like that. Gosh, my hands look funny on the screen then. They're running really fast. Anyone in any kind of startup, anyone who's been a founder, anyone who's been in a fast-growing company that, even if they're 400 people and they're growing to 600, those environments are chaotic and things are changing very quickly. People's roles are changing, projects are changing, things are failing, they're pivoting, the world's changing. It's a constant sort of battle, and business plans go out the window and new ones get created. So if you actually ask them what they're doing right now, they often kind of look at you a little sort of frazzled and go, I don't really know where we are right now. Well, hold on, we've got that launching next week. Or, oh, did that launch 2 weeks ago? They're a bit like that. And that's by no means a sort of, I'm not questioning that. I think that's the way those businesses need to be run. It's not by any means a slant on them. It's just how they are. And it's how they need to be successful. And if they're not being like that, if they're like, no, this is the plan and this is happening here and this is happening here and this is happening here and we're not going to deviate from that, well, they probably won't be there in 6 months, because that's just not how that world works. And hopefully most of the people watching this know that and understand that. So if someone comes in and says, so what are you up to right now? And then they haven't got a clear picture, they sound disorganized. They're not disorganized. They're just frantic and running at a million miles an hour, which is why they're hiring so many people. So I think getting them to, and I said, it's a take a breath moment. We'll go and spend time with them. And we'll get them to sit down and we'll talk about it and we'll look at what's going on and what didn't happen. There might have been things that were supposed to happen 3 weeks ago that are no longer happening, and just get them to take that breath, particularly before we do, or they do specifically, any interviews. But it helps us as well to be able to give candidates very clear pictures. If people are given a clear picture by us or by their internal talent team of exactly where they're at, it gives them a huge sense of comfort that they're joining a business that is probably going to be there in 6 months. And again, it's counterintuitive. The ones that can tell you that like that probably aren't. And the ones that can't tell you probably are. But when you're sort of talking to people and selling the business, you need to be able to give some sense of control and sense of, I guess, stability to some degree, particularly even more so now. Stability is becoming a very important thing to people because of the world that we have moved into currently. It's quite fascinating that a lot of the things that you think are the opposite when you're hiring with a fast-growing business. And this is what we do. We help these people understand that when you're growing at pace, whether you're a startup or a scale-up, a lot of the stuff that you think is the right thing to do is completely the wrong. And we're there to help them, guide them through that.
Yeah, that's interesting. It kind of makes me want to ask, and maybe this is a simple question, but I think it's worthwhile asking for the audience that that we're speaking to today. And guys, again, if you want to ask questions, feel free. So, you work specifically in hiring talent for those startup scale-up businesses, right? So what's the difference between talent acquisition there versus an established organization? Like, do you see startup scale-ups sort of trying to do the same thing that big corporates are doing, trying to play that game when it comes to talent acquisition?
We see them, a lot of, as much as we do the hiring for them, we spend a lot of time coaching and mentoring. It's not something that we charge or try and offer as a paid service. our belief is to just try and help these businesses succeed. And if they succeed, then that will probably lead to our success as well. And we've always had that. So a lot of what we do is more just being someone to talk to. A lot of founders or co-founders, if they haven't done a business before, or if they're on their own, they just don't have anybody to talk to bounce ideas off, or to give them an impartial opinion. So then you sort of see them looking to what they. So, for example, if they've come from a corporate, or if they've come from a larger organization, they'll revert back to what they know. Like most people do in stressful situations, they tend to revert back to what they know. And if that business wasn't a startup, that can be not a great idea for them. And to be fair, a lot of them have come from startups, but they maybe weren't exposed to how they went about hiring them. So they just might not have the knowledge. It's really just a knowledge gap. It's not so much that they're copying. It's like anything in life. If you don't know how to do something, you revert back to your memories or your experiences of going through that from the other side, which sometimes, not always, is just not the right thing. Or they just don't do anything at all. That's the other thing. They just sort of panic and start hiring people because they feel they need to hire people, and hiring the wrong people, which everybody knows, and even they do deep down, is the wrong thing to do. But it just seems like the only thing or the only option they have. I think it's just a sense of not knowing what to do, and they can't afford to go and pay a consultancy or an HR person to come in and advise them and give them all this complicated advice as to the ways to do it and how to create their employee. But they just want someone to talk to and some ideas and some things to do that aren't going to cost them anything, really.
Do you think there's also a little bit
of... You know about that, right? Because you are one of LinkedIn's queens, and you know that they can achieve so much around their employee brands, right? I mean, there's no question. For anyone out there who doesn't know, I was actually having a coffee with Lauren not that long ago, and someone came up and said, "Oh, you're LinkedIn royalty," and they knew who she was. So don't let her not, because that happened.
Well, I think it's also, the thing I was going to say is like, I feel like there is that when you've started something new and you're kind of trying to establish your brand, and then you're like, oh, great, we're getting this early success, this is awesome. There can be like, there's FOMO stuff going on where we're worried about what are we missing out on? What do we need to be doing, right? From the marketing side, there's also that like wanting to hold on to things. I know for me as like a small business owner, there's definitely that temptation to, oh, I don't really want to let go of control of that. And as a result, you can't actually be out there telling those stories about your company as well. So that's the challenge I often see, is that kind of when it comes to the marketing side, it's not happening and the brand isn't growing because there's all these problems internally. You know what I mean?
Yeah, look, I agree. I think we've talked a lot about the different personalities of founders, and generally, and I don't mean this for everyone out there, but generally, founders are control freaks, and that's what makes them founders. And they have a sense of belief about things, and they don't want to let things go. It's the biggest problem we have with any early stage ones. And then the weird thing about founders is, they start off with this control thing, and then they begin to understand they need to let go. And then for some reason, when they get to, I don't know, Series C or D again, they get it back again. It's quite strange. I've not quite learned how to understand that yet. That's something I've got to work on. But you're right. It's a sense of they don't have the time, they don't have the knowledge, but they don't want to let it go either. And then it's not going anywhere. And that's where people like you obviously come in and help them do that. And it's such an important thing to understand that you have to know what you're good at as a founder. And some come from marketing backgrounds, and some come from tech backgrounds, and some come from sales backgrounds, and some come from business backgrounds, and so forth. But the most of them tend to be highly skilled individuals who are good at the service or product that they're offering, as opposed to business or marketers. And I think that's what they need to just try and let go little by little, and they'll begin to see the results, and then they'll get that belief back.
Do you think, I was just thinking, I came up with a little theory while you were saying that about, they'll kind of let go and then not let go. And I'm thinking about my own personal experience. Just again, this is with my small business, but kind of almost like, I think I self-sabotaged a little bit. Like I kind of went, I'm a bit all or nothing, right? And I don't know if this is a typical entrepreneur thing, but I think it could be, where we can kind of be a little bit like all or nothing, right? So then we go, oh, okay, like I'm either going to have complete ownership of this strategy, or someone else is going to completely do this for me.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And
right.
we kind of sabotage it, right? And
Yeah,
then we
yeah.
sabotage it, and then we kind of go like, oh, I just recruited all the wrong people to do this for me.
Yeah, look, who would have guessed you're an all or nothing person? Do you think the viewers have worked that one out? I think you're, I think you're right. I think people want to own it, or they don't want to have anything to do with it. And that's again, that's the evolution of, I guess, running a business. Is having trust in other people to do it, but not just pushing it away so that you don't have any responsibility for it. And I think that's the natural thing. It's like, well, if I'm not going to control it, well, then I'm not going to be responsible for it. That's it. It's got nothing to do with me. It's that person. It's again, and that, I get that comes with time. I think it's a natural human trait that if you are a bit of a control freak, if you're not allowed to be the control freak in that, then you don't want to have anything to do with it because you don't want to be sort of blamed for it. And that's the whole evolution of a founder becoming a leader, which is another whole conversation. And that journey is not an easy one for some, and it's very easy for others. So I think it varies, but there is a sense of all or nothing in most founders, I think.
We got a question, Steve, and guys, we've got to finish up relatively soon. And Steve and I can talk, so if you've got questions, get them in now so we
I can
address
see the
them.
question here. Yeah, are you going to read it? You read it out.
I'll read it out. So it's from Anne-Marie Walton. Hey, Anne-Marie, thanks for your question. She said, as Steve noted, many founders are running fast. How can you use story to help the balance of a new employee coming in and not feeling pressured to do the same?
Okay, so I think what you're saying then is how can you use your story to not feel new employees? Oh, okay, for the employees not to feel that they have to run fast. And then, okay, I understand. Right. So I think story works really well in that because people generally work very well with a couple of different things. Firstly is knowing where they're at. Second is knowing where they're going and what's expected. And I think that's the number one thing for anyone in any job is understanding what's expected of them. Now, as we said, in these companies that are growing at this frenetic rate, that can sometimes change and it can change regularly. So the first thing you need to do in your story is convey that when you're hiring people so that you hire people who can cope with that because some people can't cope with that change. But then when things do change, you come back to the story and rather than just saying, oh, we're doing this now, we're doing this, you go back to the story that you originally had and you said, you know how we were here? Well, we're kind of here now and now we're going over here. And you use the storytelling technique so that they understand that it makes sense and it aligns with them still, that there's a reason why we keep chopping and changing. It's not because the founder's crazy and can't make their mind up. It's because your story is going down a meandering road depending upon external factors and the things that are happening. So it really is just a way of explaining why things are changing and why their roles might be changing or whatever it is that is changing so that they don't feel crazy pressure. And I think that's what you're saying. I think if you work in these companies, there's always going to be an element of running fast because that's how they run. And again, if your employees don't like running fast, they probably shouldn't work in these kind of organizations. There are plenty of there used to be plenty of corporate roles where they can go and not run fast. So you can use the story to perhaps help explain to them why and when things are going and make them feel a sense of comfort and purpose. But I think ultimately, if you work in this kind of organization, you need to hire people who like to run fast because that's what's going to work for you. So don't be afraid to not necessarily pressure them, but let them know their expectations. Most human beings react very positively when they feel like they're having an impact. They feel like they're having an impact on something and they can see the results of what they do. That gives them huge satisfaction, more so than monetary or anything else I've found. So again, you can use the story to explain to them why things are changing and what impact that's going to have. You can use that sort of technique, if you like, to explain it. And that will keep them motivated and hopefully keep them wanting to run at least semi-fast, maybe not as fast as the founder.
We've only got 5 minutes left, and I want to kind of I want to, Steve, you can tell me if you want to do this, but I think we should end with giving some like sort of a bit of action, step by step kind of how to for people to walk away with and remember, and also just share a little bit about us if people want to find out more. So, from your perspective, given what we've spoken about today, what are the next steps for people who are kind of like, I want to attract top talent? What do they need to go away and think about?
They need to go and think about their story. And what I mean by that is think about why they started, what were those reasons they started, and how those initial sort of months or years went. They need to think about exactly what's happening right now, and then they think about what's happening in the future. And then they need to be able to put that into a narrative that they can talk about in under 2 or 3 minutes. I think that's really the key.
For me, I think like just following on from that storytelling aspect, there's like these 5 elements of story that are like super useful to go and look at, like just as a template for writing story. And it's also what I base like all my interview formats on. So if people want to find out more about storytelling, that's something that I can help with from a marketing perspective. But essentially, it's 5 things. So first thing you have to do is you have to set the scene. You have to be like, here's the current situation. That's why exactly what you're saying, Steve, matters so much, right? It's like you need to know what the current situation is to say it. Here's the current situation. And also here's the current situation for this candidate. What's going on for them and what's going on for me, and where are those connection points? Where can we exchange value together? Then after you set the current situation, you go, okay, what's the challenge? What's the challenge from their perspective? What's the challenge from our perspective? Can you talk about issues of conflict? And then you want to talk about results. So when you're talking about past, present, future, that's like, where are we going, right? Here's the results. Here's the outcome that we want. And here's the solution for how we're going to get there. So I'd really encourage people who are trying to map out their story to go and look up that sort of like story template to just in like one sentence each kind of map that out. What do you think, Steve? Do you agree?
I totally agree. And like yourself, if anyone wants any help, I'm more than happy to have a phone call, conversation with anyone and just help them tease out their story. Sometimes you need someone else to help you. Maybe it can be your co-founder, maybe even some of your staff, your friends. But if you really can't find anyone, feel free to give myself or Lauren a call. We do it all day, every day in different capacities, and we talk about it a lot. So happy to have another conversation with anyone who wants to about that. That's fine. Lauren, why don't you explain what you do? Because we've talked a lot about, obviously we're a recruitment business that work in the startup space, but why don't you talk a little bit about what you do as well, just so people know your all or nothing personality and what you're up to.
Well, actually, what I do is essentially kind of this, right, Steve? So that's how you and I met. I started interviewing you for your podcast show, and I run my own podcast show as well called Grow Your Brand, which is currently on the front page of Apple Podcasts, which I'm super, super excited about. Yeah, it's really cool. I saw it and I was like, this is awesome. So for people who want to find out more about me, and I mean, you've kind of seen me interview, but essentially what I've done is taken the thing that I absolutely love to do most in the world, which is have conversations, and turn it into an offer that people can use to tell their stories, but specifically to tell their stories out in market. So I'm always looking at how do we tell this story to external stakeholders to attract clients, to attract customers, and build your sort of like content plan the easiest and most effective way we can. So that's what I do. And if people want to find out more about me, head over to laurenkress.com, or you can go to the Grow Your Brand podcast to listen to more interviews. Steve, do you want to finish off by telling people where they can go to find out more about you as well?
Well, if they want to find out more about you, they just need to go to page 1 of the Apple podcast. Is that not right? Are you right there now?
No, for you.
For me, Ola, please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn if you want to know anything more about me. And we're also just about to launch sort of a semi-TV show to give founders an opportunity to talk about their brands and help grow their brands. And that's a service we're sort of offering for nothing to give them a platform. So if anyone's interested in coming on that show, please let me know as well. All of this stuff that we offer, we're not charging anything for all this. This is really just to help you guys succeed, and more than happy to do that.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that. Well, we're both conversationalists.
We've got 20 seconds left. I think we just get cut off like that when it finishes. I'm not sure.
I'm so proud of us of being able to finish this in this time. So thank you everyone for being a
Thank
part of
you.
this live stream with us, and look forward to hearing from some of you soon.